On March 8th, the Philippines took part in the worldwide celebration of International Women's Day. Advocates celebrated women's rights advancement in the country. They also called for better empowerment and protection. Women represent roughly half the Philippine population. But did you know that among overseas Filipino workers, women outnumber men? According to 2021 data from the Philippine Statistics Authority, 60.2% or 1.1 million of the 1.83 million OFWs worldwide were women. Most women are in elementary occupations, including domestic work. Domestic work puts our women OFWs in vulnerable positions, a reason for the never ending stories of abuse, exploitation, and social costs. Still, overseas Filipino women continue to fight for their right to work abroad with dignity, whether they are in care work or in managerial positions. Hello, I'm Michelle Abad, and welcome to At Home sa Abroad, Rappler's one stop show for everything related to the Filipino diaspora. Here we discuss topics important to Filipinos all over the world, from concerns and welfare of overseas Filipino workers to celebrating Pinoy success stories to reconnecting with cultural roots at iba pa. In celebration of Women's Month, we have in this episode two guests from different corners of the world. Ivy Ancheta is the Marketing and Communications Head of the NGO Sandigan, Bahrain. Dr. Joanna Zulueta is a sociology professor at Toyo University in Japan and has written about women and migration. Ivy, Joanna, welcome to the show.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, so I'll just start with a question for both of you. No? So I wanted to ask, what are the common reasons that Filipino women choose to work abroad? Actually, here in At Home sa Abroad, an earlier episode, Professor Jean Franco from the University of the Philippines discussed how the social cost of labor migration started when women entered the OFW job market. So what are your thoughts on this? Maybe we'll start with you, Ivy.
Okay, actually, the number one reason why women go abroad is poverty. Women would like to provide for their families. They would like to provide a better life for their families. They would like to send their children to good schools. And for some people, they would want to support the medical conditions of their ailing family member. And for younger professionals, of course, they would want a better opportunity for themselves. They would want to advance their careers and maybe a better salary package.
Joanna, would you like to add?
Yes, apart from, of course, the economic reasons for migrating, right? Especially because most of these migrant workers, migrant female workers, they're actually breadwinners, or they're actually expected to provide for their families back in the Philippines. So that's one, economic, financial reasons. And you also, as Ivy also mentioned, more opportunities that are somehow lacking in the Philippines, right? That's why you have all these professionals um, moving to other countries.
Mhm. And we can really see that there's, a trend of women becoming breadwinners more. No, and it's kind of a non-traditional type of role for them, and seeing how this is a trend, not just in Bahrain but in different parts of the world. And so I'll go back to you, Dr. Joanna. So you've taught you're teaching sociology at Toyo University, and you've also written about women and migration. So I just wanted to ask you, can you please take us into the history of women migrating to work in Japan and East Asia, especially the Filipino migrant workers? No, where do we find them, and how have they been treated throughout the years? And perhaps what issues and protections do they experience today?
Okay, so we all know that the earlier female migrants from the Philippines to Japan came in the late 70s, early 80s. These are the so-called Japayukis, or the entertainers, those women who came on an entertainment visas. And many of them actually settled down in Japan, marrying Japanese. They have families, and now they even have their grandchildren, their apos. So you have that. That's why female migration to Japan, particularly from the Philippines, is very much feminized. So where do we find them? They're pretty much visible, right? If you go to, let's say, Tokyo, Osaka, you go to the Philippine pubs, they are there. But then you also have, of course, um, marriage migrants, for instance. You know, these are the women or these were the women who came to Japan to be brides for Japanese men, particularly those living in rural areas. So they came late 80s to early 90s. You also have, of course, domestic workers in Japan. They're pretty much invisible, but they work for expats. They came under the designated visas or designated activities visas, because it's really difficult for domestic workers to work in Japan. But although the previous Japanese administrations tried to hire these domestic workers, but it was actually difficult. But for these Filipino domestic workers, their employers are foreigners. Then, of course, you have the nurses and care workers who came under the JPEPA, or the Japan Philippines Economic Partnership Agreement. So you have care workers, caregivers, and nurses. And recently, you have this trend of English teachers, mostly females, coming to Japan. They are called ALTs, or assistant language teachers. They are hired to give assistance, English language assistance, to the main English teachers. So they're like the assistant teachers, assistant language teachers. And so that's actually a trend. And you even have former entertainers entering this profession, having their own, English language schools, or working as ALTs as well, or even care workers. So this is basically the Philippine migration to Japan.
Mhm. What are some of the issues that and perhaps not just the issues, but also the protection mechanisms? Because like you did mention that there are some certain programs between the Philippines and Japan that allow the women to migrate there for work. So I imagine that there's particular partnerships between the Philippines and Japan. So are there any issues and protection mechanisms that Filipino women workers in Japan currently experience now?
I think, to my knowledge, for example, for the JPEPA, the Japan Philippines Economic Partnership Agreement, so the Philippines was last to sign the agreement. You had Indonesia and Vietnam sending, or they actually sent their workers, nurses and caregivers ahead of us, because I think that this was during the Arroyo administration, because we really wanted to have this negotiation with Japan, that our workers will be very much protected when they come to Japan, right? So those are the mechanisms. And of course, you have, you may have the rules in place, the regulations in place, but of course, if you talk about the problems that these migrants experience, you have several issues. For example, of course, in the 80s, for example, you had sexual harassment, intimate violence towards these so-called japayukis, the entertainers, right? Um, you also had abuse, right? But then it's really difficult, because especially if they're marriage migrants, for instance, that the abuse happens at home, right? You also have harassment in the workplace, whether it's racial discrimination, sexual discrimination, gender discrimination, or even sexual harassment, which um, some Filipino female workers actually experience. In fact, I just co-authored a study on ALTs, female ALTs, and their experience of harassment in the workplace, especially, and also discrimination in especially in the workplace, especially their plight during the COVID pandemic. So you have all of these issues, but unfortunately, even though you have rules, Japan has really strict rules with regards to labor migration, even within the workplace. But sadly, you still have these issues that affect our migrant workers, and they also actually affect female Japanese workers. So maybe apart from racial discrimination, the Japanese workers are also very much discriminated against in terms of gender.
Right. That That's very important that you pointed that out. That it's not just the fact that they have to deal with possible racism, but they're the added layers that they're also women, foreigners, right? Which also might make them more vulnerable in that type of setting, which may not only be in Japan but in other parts of the world. So I'll come back to you, Joanna, later on. Ivy, I want to ask a little bit more about Sandiga and Bahrain and the work that you do. So I understand that many OFWs in Bahrain are women. So how does Sandigan cater to them?
Well, Sandigan Bahrain, as you have said earlier, that we are a nonprofit organization, and we are actually giving them the awareness of their rights with regards to their the hours of work and the some of the labor laws that is currently implemented here in Bahrain. So we are catering to women, especially with in terms of abuses. There are women who are abused in their workplace, especially the domestic workers. So there are cases that we are forced to rescue them from their employers. And Sandigan Bahrain is there to actually help these workers to know their rights and for us to link them to the proper channels, give them the opportunity to go to the embassy, for example, and help them defend their rights. In some cases, the embassy are giving them attorneys to help them with their cases, but there are some cases where we link them to the liaison officers for them to defend their rights.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned their rights and the cases that Sandigan Bahrain helps assist with these migrant workers. I wanted to go into Bahrain law a little bit because it's quite interesting in some research that I did before this. So Bahrain law is a combination of royal decrees, civil and criminal measures, and Sharia law. So according to nonprofit organization Borgen Project, the secular part of Bahraini law advances women's rights, but the religious part holds them back. So I wanted to know, have you observed this in the migrant workers that you help? Like, can you give us a lowdown on these legal contradictions? Like, what are the common issues that they face, and what are the challenges in representing these women in these legal cases?
You are right when you said that the Bahraini law is leading towards the rights of women. In fact, the law here is actually equal to both the employer and the employees. However, there are still some people. I would not say that this is a religious issue, but rather cultural, on how the Bahrainis or the employers rather, interpret their religious beliefs, because there are still some employers who would perceive the employees as their property. So if you are my employee, I own you and I tell you what to do. I tell you when to sleep. I tell you if I will tell you if you are free to go. If you would want to transfer to a different employer, I can tell you. I will tell you if I agree to that or not.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, I would rather say that it is more of a cultural rather than a religious issue.
Mm-hmm. What are some common cases that are brought to you?
Most of the workers that would come to us would complain about the hours of work that they would entail their employers. They are they are actually cases when they are already getting sick because of the long hours of work, especially for this upcoming Ramadan season, that where they actually shift the where actually they shift the hours. They work more on the evenings because they are busier that time, because some of the because most of the employers are Muslims. So because they are fasting in the morning and they are awake and in the evenings. So they normally serve their employers at that time. And there are also some cases when they are actually not just working in a particular employer, but they are actually lent to a family member. So they are actually overworked. So these are the common cases that we handle. There are also cases when they are not given day offs. They will not be permitted to go out of the house and just continue working. They will only be allowed to go out if they are sending money to their families back home, but only at a certain time period, say an hour or two, and then they have to go back to their own to the employer's houses during. So these are the common cases that we normally encounter.
You mentioned that there are certain barriers when it comes to culture and religion that may contradict the protections that women have. So, has there ever been a case that you've handled where culture got in the way of seeking justice for a certain abused migrant woman worker there in Bahrain?
I think when it comes to the what is this, their belief of being owning the particular employee, that is number one of the barrier that we think. Um, Actually, the main reason, the main barrier that when it comes to their cases here in Bahrain is language, more than the culture, because most of the entities here, they write the documents in Arabic, they speak in Arabic, especially if the case gets into the courthouses.
Hmm.
So
When
it's
it
really
comes,
important.
sorry,
Sorry,
go ahead.
so it's really important that someone who speaks the language would represent this worker in the court for the justice to be served.
Hmm. When it's particularly related to gender-based violence, like for example, if it's sexual harassment or sexual abuse, rape, are there certain, like, do they see the woman as since you mentioned that there was some equal portions of the employee and the employer, so when it comes to gender-based violence, would you say that culture and religion does not get in the way when it comes to those types of cases? What do you think?
It actually depends on the lawyer and how the lawyer defends the abused. Because if there are cases when because of the language barrier, the abused or the women employee may not be able to express herself properly, because even though the worker has been working with this particular employer for a long time, she would be able to speak bits and bits of Arabic and would be able to explain some of what happened to her. But there are cases when she could not totally explain herself, and this will make the case uh, proceed very, very slow. So I think that that's the main, if not the only, reason why such cases would not proceed properly.
Okay. Okay, thanks, Ivy. I'll go back to you, Joanna. So I wanted to go back to gender discrimination that you also mentioned earlier when you were talking about challenges that Filipino migrant workers in Japan were experiencing. So is gender discrimination an issue in Japanese and East Asian labor, regardless of the type of work? So whether that's a kasambahay or a managerial position, does labor or does gender discrimination exist among those types of work? And in general, in what ways are women disproportionately affected by labor migration issues from men?
Okay, yes, thank you for that question. Yes, indeed, gender discrimination is very much an issue, not only in Japan, but I guess also in other parts of Asia, particularly with regards to pay. So even if you are doing the same work, and I'm talking about, let's say, professionals. So even if you're doing the same work as the men, then you still get low pay. So you're paid lower than men. And this is actually an issue not only from the migrant perspective, not only experienced by the migrants themselves, but this is also an issue experienced by women from the host countries, let's say in Japan and Korea, for instance. So they're paid lower than men. And then second is the fact that especially for example in Japanese society, right? Women are expected to marry then give birth. So they're expected to leave the workplace earlier than men to take care of their children. So and that's it's one of the reasons why they're paid lower than men. And I would like to believe that it also affects foreigners, including Filipinos. And you also have to add, of course, if we're coming from the perspective of intersectionality, for instance, right? So it's not only gender, but you also have to take into consideration the race and also nationality of the women, especially with regards to Filipino women workers. For instance, if you talk about, let's say, the English language teachers or the assistant language teachers, many of which are Filipino women. And I've spoken to some of these. I've spoken to some people who also did research on the ALTs, saying that Filipinos are also discriminated not only on the basis of their gender, but also on the basis of their nationality because they're not native enough, right? And then because of their race, right? Because they're not white. So they don't have the correct racial uniform, so to speak. So those are the issues with regards to gender discrimination. So it's not only affecting the migrants themselves, but you also, because this is actually an issue in East Asia, particularly in Japan and Korea, wherein women are really discriminated against in the workplace in terms of pay, in terms of harassment as well. And of course, if you are a foreigner, then you are in much vulnerable position because you're not, let's say you're not Japanese, right? You're not a citizen of that country because you are a migrant. So you have those kinds of issues in the workplace.
Mm. I'm a little curious about how gender discrimination does apply with managerial positions. So I'm curious if you've read also in your work that perhaps, are there cases that for example, if a company is hiring for a managerial position, is it more likely for a man to succeed in that area than a woman? Is there information on that?
Yes, there's a lot of work written, especially if you're looking at the Japanese perspective, and that's why in the Philippines we really don't have any issues with regards to women in managerial positions, women CEOs, for instance. Um, Japan scores very low. I forgot which number, but it's in the hundreds. I think 116 in the recent or last year's gender gap report. And one of the reasons is the fact that you don't have women in managerial positions in the workplace. You don't have women in politics, for instance, right, or in parliament. So it's pretty low. And in fact, in the Philippine workplace, for example, we have more women. So that is one issue in Japan. And of course, it's not only affecting Japanese women; it's also affecting also foreign women. And for example, if you look at the academia, Japan also has this goal to have a more multicultural and more gender diverse academic population in the coming 30 years or in the next 30 years. But then I don't know if they're going to achieve that because you're not only talking about the numbers, right? You may hire all the foreign faculty members you can hire or all the female faculty members or foreign female faculty members. But then the issue is not really in the numbers. The issue is really giving them um, equal pay, for example, equal regard in the workplace in terms of research, etc., in terms of um, less harassment, for example, but protection against sexual harassment or gender harassment, gender discrimination in the workplace as well.
Mhm. Just one more follow up on how exactly does the pay gap happen? No, it's like apart from the maternal leaves that some women have to take, which is one reason why they get paid less. Are there any other like is it institutionalized that men should receive more pay than women even if they're working in the same job? Like how does that work apart from perhaps the maternal leave aspect?
It's not really institutionalized, but then you have laws, right? It's there written clearly, but then the reality is different, right? Or on the other hand, you also have actually you have maternity leaves, you also have paternity leaves, but then for the men, they don't actually use these paternity leaves because they're expected to work. So that's another issue that's also gendered, right? With regards to men. But then going back to the case of women, so it's not really institutionalized, right? It's but then it happens. So sexism happens, sexual harassment happens because and many of these are also indirect um, gender discrimination. Actually, especially if you talk about sexism, for example, or everyday sexism, you some people think of it as happening every day. Somehow it's normalized or expected, but then it's already actually harassment or sexism. So it's also very much a touchy issue, for example. So and then you factor in the case of race or ethnicity, right? So yeah, maybe in terms of hiring, for example, they would prefer, let's say, men over women or white a white female over a colored female or a Filipino female, for example, for English teaching. So these are the issues. Yeah. So far these are the issues in the professional workplace.
Mhm. Okay, thanks, Joanna. I'll go back to you, Ivy. You Sandigan Bahrain puts a lot of emphasis on making OFWs aware of their rights and asserting them in times of abuse, especially, and even if they're not abused. Why do you think it's important to empower women migrant workers and ensure that they're aware of their rights?
Well, domestic workers, migrant workers, women especially, they have to know their rights because they are the most vulnerable. And especially with the domestic workers that we are working with right now, they are being abused mostly because they don't know their rights. So they will be asked to work for long hours. They would just do it, not because they are hardworking, but because they don't know that they should be working only for a maximum of 12 hours each day. They will not be given day offs, and they will think that it's okay because they don't know that they have to be they have to be resting at least once per week. So that's the reason why it is very important for us to educate them and to make them aware that these are their rights, so that they would be empowered not to answer back to their employers, of course. We also teach them how to assert their rights in the most polite way. And and also we link them to the proper channels of the government, to the Philippine Embassy here in Bahrain, and to the labor market uh, or labor organizations that they can run to in case they are being abused.
Mhm. I wanted to know a little bit more about do you have coordination, for example, with, you mentioned some coordination with the Philippine Embassy, but
Mhm.
what comes to my mind when it comes to rights awareness is also the pre-departure orientation seminar that OFWs have to go through here with OWA before they get deployed abroad. So I know that in these pre-departure orientation seminars, there's talk about, the culture in the place that you're going to, or things that you need to know basically so that you don't get culture shocked, when you go into your new host country. But has there been any recommendations, for example, that the Filipinos who go through these orientation seminars should be, given more awareness about the rights that they have in the particular countries? Like, is there any coordination with that?
I think before we actually go out, like because I'm a migrant worker myself, so before we go out of the country, we are asked to attend this particular seminars or orientations, and it's not really focused on a particular country because at least when I was there are a lot of different countries that I am with. So, for example, like there are people who go to Japan or to UK or to all parts of the world, and it's not really focused on a particular country that this is the culture that you are about to face when you get there. They will talk about a brief about the culture that you may encounter, but so with regards to the coordination, because when we get here, it's you were just given a brief, and the reality is different. Um, they would be shocked. Yes, we are preparing them because of their this orientations, but I don't think it's enough because it will just run for a few hours in a day. So, with regards to coordination, what we're doing right now as Sandigan Bahrain, we are actually inviting them over in our in a particular setting where we can actually explain to them their rights and tell them where they can go in case these rights are not followed.
Mhm. Okay, so it's nice to see that the Sandigan Bahrain is actually augmenting, how the PDOS can only be like used for general OFWs, regardless of where they're going. So it's nice to see that there's a nonprofit that is specifically going into the rights there in Bahrain. So speaking of, recommendations, policies, measures that can better make migrant workers aware of their rights and to allow them to know where to go when they're protected. I'll go to you, Joanna, again. So, what are some policy recommendations that the Philippine government can consider in better protecting migrant Filipino women?
Okay, one is, as Ivy mentioned, the PDOS, pre-departure orientation seminars. I noticed that it is not country specific, and especially for a country like Japan, which is very culturally complex. So it would be best if there are some sort of country specific um, PDOS orientations for migrants, for migrant workers. So yeah, I think the government is doing its part, especially like the Commission on Filipinos Overseas, especially when they are, because they're trying to prevent human trafficking, especially now with the increase of marriage migrants, right? Because of the internet. So you have, I mean, in fact, I was just there a couple of weeks ago in Manila, and I was told that you have like these professional women in the Philippines wanting to marry foreigners and who they met online, right? But you really don't know if they're legitimate, how to call it, if they're not scammers, right? Because you also have those people online. So CFO is actually doing its part to curb human trafficking. So that's one, especially for policy recommendations for those going abroad. I also would like to add some other things, especially with regards to, let's say, Filipinos who are already in the country and who might want to return, right, in the host country. For example, in the case of Japan, as I've mentioned, most women are actually now married, right? Married, they have their own families, they even have their own grandchildren. But then when you talk to them, many of them still want to return, right? So you have the issue of aging and also return. So what can the government do for these aging migrants, especially with regards to social security issues such as SSS, right? The payment of their SSS, especially for those who discontinued the payment of your SSS and then they would like to claim the benefits. So many of them are not actually aware of how to do that, right? So those kinds of legal and financial um, um, things, right? And also again, for aging migrants, especially, for example, aging domestic workers. And I met many of them in Malaysia when I did a bit of research 5 years ago in Malaysia. So you have um, 70-year-olds, late 60s, who are still working as domestic workers. And I mean, Malaysia puts a cap on on hiring domestic workers, right? But then they were able to stay on because of their employers. So but yet they're still there, and I don't know if the Philippine government really has any idea that you have aging migrants in these countries because they still need to work to support their families back home. So how can the government, for example, um, deal with these people who are aging, right, and who eventually might return home, right, or if they, let's say, pass away in the host country, right? So you have those issues, and then you also have the viability of return, especially for people who want to return. And many of the aging migrants in Japan actually want to return to the Philippines, but then they tell me, how can we return if we lack healthcare services back in our homeland? Whereas in Japan, we enjoy all these benefits, but we also would like to go home. So that's another thing. And you also have, of course, the issue of undocumented migrants. I did not mention that earlier, but we also have a lot of undocumented migrants here in Japan, and I'm assuming in other parts of the world. But in the case of Japan, you have, of course, female undocumented workers, male undocumented workers. So what happens to them if they, let's say, age and then become sickly, etc., especially here in the case of Japan, that if you're undocumented, it's difficult for you to access health services. For the other migrants, for the women married to Japanese, most are permanent residents, so in terms of healthcare, in terms of other social services, they are able to access them. But then how about these undocumented workers, right? Or those who are under social welfare, particularly after divorcing their husbands, and they don't have, like, let's say, the permanent resident visa. So those are, I think, well, not really recommendations, but I think issues that the government can probably address, because migrants are actually aging as well. So how would the government address this issue of aging, the aging of migrant Filipinos and also Filipinas, because aging is also very much gendered, and also the issue of return in case they intend to return. So yeah, I hope I made sense.
Yeah, it does make sense. It's really interesting how you pointed out how there must be institutionalized policies with the protection of migrants before the PIDOS, during, whether they're documented or undocumented, and after, when they retire, when they're dealing with aging, and when they eventually, if they eventually want to go home to the Philippines. So I think we can end on that note. So I just wanted to thank you again so much, Ivy and Joanna, for your time.
Thank you
Thank
very
you.
much. Thank you.
Okay. Again, you're tuned into At Homes Abroad on Rappler. I'm Michelle Abad. Thank you for watching.